Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, or rather the person that we're hosting for the Q&A today, Ronan Levy. So Ronan Levy is the co-founder and executive chairman of FieldTrip. FieldTrip offers legal ketamine clinics in the US, Canada, and Amsterdam, integrating ketamine with psychotherapy to treat conditions like treatment-resistant depression and PTSD. Concurrent with his work at FieldTrip, Ronan is a partner at Grass-Fed Ventures, a venture capital and advisory firm focused on the cannabis and biotech industries, and is chief strategy officer and member of the board of directors for Trait Biosciences, Inc., a leading biotech company in the hemp and cannabis industries. Prior to his current roles, Ronan, along with other people on the FieldTrip team, co-founded Canadian Cannabis Clinics and Cannabis RX, Inc., the latter of which was acquired by Aurora Cannabis, Inc. in 2016, after which he served as senior vice president, business and corporate affairs for Aurora. Ronan, thank you so much for joining us today. So I thought that our conversation could consist of three main parts. First, the psychedelic properties of ketamine. Second, psychedelic integration and what that looks like in FieldTrip's therapy. And third and finally, accessibility. But first, I was wondering if you just give the audience a brief introduction to what FieldTrip does, as well as the current state of affairs for ketamine therapy in the US, in the UK, and around the world.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. So brief overview of FieldTrip. We're really focused on trying to mainstream the conversation around psychedelics and psychedelic assisted therapies, but in a way that's very conscious and focused on keeping it legal and avoiding some of the mistakes that may have been made in the late 60s and early 70s. And so we operate in two primary divisions. We have our FieldTrip Health division, which is building out the clinical infrastructure to develop to deliver psychedelic therapies at scale. When we started back in 2000 and early 2019, late 2018, trying to figure out what we're going to do within this space, we had the good fortune of talking to Rick Doblin and Michael Pollan and the folks at the Beckley Institute. And all of them said, we need new clinical infrastructure. Psychedelic assisted therapies aren't going to reach the people we want to reach if they're being done in conventional doctors' offices. It's just not going to happen. And so that was the source of inspiration to start opening up our FieldTrip Health Centers. We've got 12 locations now, primarily providing ketamine assisted therapy, but in the Netherlands, we're providing psilocybin assisted therapy in a clinical setting as opposed to a retreat setting. So that's one exception there. And then on the other side of the equation, FieldTrip Discovery is our drug development division. So we're developing novel psychedelic molecules as well. Our first one is something called FD104, which is a novel form of 4-HO-DIPT, which makes it it's a prodrug form, so it's more soluble and thus a better drug product. And what we like about that is objectively in the brain, the binding constants of 4-HO and FT104 are virtually identical to psilocybin. So the experience is subjectively and objectively very much like psilocybin, but has a much shorter duration of experience. So instead of spending 4, 6, or 8 hours in a clinical setting, the hope is that in 2 to 3 hours you could have a very therapeutic experience and get back to your life on a more expedited basis. So just making it, some people don't like the idea of shortening or truncating a psychedelic experience because you may take something away, and there may or may not be truth to that. But from I think, medical therapeutic application perspective, shorter duration is going to be better. It's just going to make it more accessible, even if there are potential trade-offs. I think it just becomes more commercially and operationally viable. So that's what we're doing with FieldTrip Discovery. The state of play around ketamine in North America, in fact, most places around the world, is ketamine is legal and prescribable by most medical practitioners, state by state. Sometimes it can be nurse practitioner, something, not as senior as a physician, I guess is the right word. I'm not exactly sure, but and so the use here primarily is off-label. We're not using Spravato or esketamine, which has been approved by the FDA. I don't think, and I forget the name of the regulatory body in the UK, but I don't think Spravato has been approved in the UK simply because it's just so expensive. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have it on the formulary. So we use racemic ketamine in our FieldTrip centers, and it's an off-label use, but that's perfectly fine in most jurisdictions. Doctors have that discretion within their practice, and so that's what we're doing. And there hasn't been a whole lot of regulatory scrutiny or consideration. There are some services like MindBloom, which does at-home ketamine. So they took advantage of a loophole that was created as a result of the pandemic, where they permitted certain scheduled substances to be delivered to people at home without the need for an in-person visit, which is usually a requirement. And so there's some regulatory questions as to whether that's going to continue to be permitted, or whether the old structure will be put back in place as the pandemic, I don't know if it ends, but people start ignoring the pandemic and just go back to normal life regardless. So that's the state of play from a legal and regulatory perspective on ketamine, at least in North America.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm sure you've already described this ad infinitum to many people, but just so the entire audience is on the same page, could you just walk us through what happens during ketamine therapy at FieldTrip? What somebody who would want to see ketamine therapy at one of your facilities could expect to experience?
Sure. It's important to note that we're different than most ketamine providers. So most ketamine clinics you'll encounter out there are providing ketamine IV infusions. So treating ketamine like an antidepressant, providing a low dose drip for 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours kind of thing. And people do definitely benefit from it, but they tend to revert to the mean after about a couple of weeks. So the benefits wear off fairly shortly. What we're doing at FieldTrip is we're treating ketamine like a psychedelic. So we're providing it in the context of psychedelic assisted therapy, which means we do preparatory work before the session. We do integration work, a little bit of integration work after, like during the session, and then deep integration works following the ketamine session. So the total experience would be, you get in touch with us, if you determine that ketamine assisted therapy is an avenue you want to pursue, we'd book our initial intake and consultation, because there's certainly some indications. By and large, ketamine is quite safe, but there are some contraindications that would mean it's not appropriate for everybody. These tend to be people who have experienced psychotic breaks or their schizophrenia, severe bipolar, uncontrolled elevated high blood pressure. There are a handful, it's not too many. So by and large, many people do qualify for ketamine assisted therapy. Assuming that the medical screening goes well, the psychiatric screening goes well, we'll book your first session, a preparatory session with your therapeutic team, so you can get to know them and they can help you prepare for the experience in terms of setting intentions, as well as just getting a handle on what to expect, because many people who come into our clinics have never experienced ketamine assisted therapy, or ketamine at all for that matter. A couple days later, you'll come in for your first session with ketamine, and what we call an exploration session. The experience lasts about an hour to an hour and a half that you're under the effects of the ketamine. And there's a period of 15 minutes or half an hour following the psychedelic experience to debrief with your therapist. You typically, ideally, do that twice, say in a week, spread out over a couple of days. And then early the following week, we would do the first pure integration session. So that's the session with no ketamine, no drug, just pure cognitive behavioral therapy, taking the insights and awareness that came out of the ketamine experience and trying to turn them into action through typically conventional cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, whether that's motivational interviewing or behavioral activation. It really is about trying to create lifestyle change. So you have mindset change through the ketamine experience. You often have some emotional processing, and then it's about how do you manifest those and entrench those changes on a more meaningful basis. And a lot of the time, that just means making changes to one's lifestyle. It means eating better. It means going to the gym. It means meditating every day. It means a whole number of things. And so we take those integration periods and take advantage of the period of neuroplasticity following the ketamine experiences to help people try and crystallize better lifestyle habits and better mindset habits and all that kind of stuff. And that's a typical experience. Most people do. So every 2 ketamine plus 1 integration session is what we call a module. And most people will do 2 to 3 modules over the course of 6 weeks or so. And that's the typical experience at FieldTrip. And then what we see is people, if we're looking at people with depression and anxiety, their scores go on average from a severe depression score according to PHQ-9 down to mild. Same with anxiety from a GAD-7 perspective. And those benefits last on average for 120 days for most people. So we're seeing really sustained, fantastic results.
Yeah, that's really incredible. I think the first thing that you said that unlike other ketamine clinics, FieldTrip is trying to embrace the psychedelic aspects of ketamine is a perfect segue into the first section of the Q&A, which is the psychedelic properties of ketamine. I should first add that there will be 30 minutes of Q&A with the audience at the end of the event. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to post them in the Zoom chat. And then I'll read them out during the Q&A section with the audience. But yeah, so let's talk about the psychedelic properties of ketamine. So you said that FieldTrip embraces the psychedelic properties of ketamine, and that includes having this preparation and integration phase as part of the therapy that you offer. In what other ways does ketamine embrace the psychedelic properties? I mean, of course, one important aspect of the psychedelic trip is indeed the preparation and the integration, but you could arguably say that's true for a number of other things as well. And there's a lot, about the essence of psychedelics as well, that does not lie in the integration and preparation. So how do you capture that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can't. I'm not sophisticated enough to get into the science. I suspect kind of you may be more equipped to talk about the science of it in depth. But what we see and the reason, there's certainly a lot of debate. I don't think it's very active debate, but there's certainly debate out there about what constitutes a psychedelic, right? Because many people could argue that it's just a tryptamine, so psilocybin, LSD, DMT, those are the psychedelics because they follow, most things from the psychedelic perspective. And so MDMA, which is now very much within the conversation of psychedelic assisted therapy, is not classically a psychedelic, but many people think it is. And ketamine kind of falls into that same scope as MDMA, which is not classically a psychedelic. But I think the kind of rule of thumb that we use at FieldTrip, it's not really a rule of thumb. The truth is like we do ketamine because that's what we're able to do. As soon as we can work with other molecules, we certainly will. But the way we think of ketamine is, or any psychedelic, is anything that kind of slows the default mode network, that quiets the ego and lets people kind of separate from their sense of self-identity to whatever lesser degree, is really the key property of psychedelics. Now we see on a neurobiological level, the impacts are actually much more meaningful. We've seen it with ketamine as well as with psilocybin. I'm not sure if other psychedelics we've seen this yet, but it creates a period of synaptogenesis. So your brain is actually growing new neural synapses following a ketamine experience. We see that with psilocybin as well. So there's definitely a biochemical and neurological aspect to what's happening in terms of the healing and improvements that people experience. But on a purely psychological level, anything that kind of creates that quiet period in the default mode network creates a period of neuroplasticity and enables people a window to actually change is something that we would consider a psychedelic. So, in that regard, some people may argue that cannabis is a psychedelic, and certainly I think it can be effectively used as a psychedelic in that regard with preparation, using the openness that comes from the cannabis or any other drug, and pairing that with psychotherapy, I think can be very psychedelic. Not conventionally defined that way, but that's how we think about it. The other key elements that we really lean into in terms of ketamine as a psychedelic is set and setting. So if you ever have a chance to look at our clinics, they don't look like doctors' offices. They've been described as spa-like or oasis-like. I prefer oasis-like because I find the term spa-like, I think, just diminishes the integrity of the work we do a little bit, but it's an okay and apt description, I think, from an aesthetic perspective. And we really lean into that because we want people to feel comfortable. We want people to feel at ease, and really position them to have a very positive experience with psychedelics. Because even though, generally speaking, people don't have negative or bad trips from ketamine, it's certainly possible. And so everything that we can do and everything that we've learned from the experience with psychedelics primarily from the 60s. Certainly there's all the historic and cultural use of psychedelics before that, but I think a lot of what informed our protocols was derived from what we've seen in the 60s, as well as the modern research at Johns Hopkins and all that kind of stuff. We really wanted to lean into that to make sure people feel safe and comfortable and at ease, so the risk of a challenging or bad trip is minimized. Does that answer your question, Kenneth?
Yeah, that definitely does. I actually also just wanted to show the audience some images of the Oasis-like facilities at FieldTrip, if that's all right, just so people get a sense of what it looks like. But yeah, these are some of the images online that you'll find of FieldTrip's clinics. So it definitely does. You guys definitely do indeed take set and setting into account. And I'll loop back to that in a second. But I wanted to first talk about what you said about how psychedelics in general psychologically quiet the ego. So what is it about FieldTrip's ketamine clinics that try to really get patients to quiet the ego? And how do you accomplish that?
I mean, from my perspective, and it's a fair question, I've never really thought about it from that lens, but I kind of assume that's what the medicine is doing. That's what the ketamine is doing. It's just, we see it in the fMRI machines. This is not just, from the psychological perspective. We've seen when you put people in an fMRI machine, certain parts of the brain light up and start interacting. Actually, various parts that don't often interact seem to interact, and then the parts that are active in kind of like your default mode tend to quiet down. So it's less about I think what we do, and certainly people are invited to meditate, and we provide them with all sorts of other tools and information that can help achieve that. Most people are not very serious, experienced meditators who can go to that monk level. We've seen that Tibetan monks can create very similar experiences to psychedelic experiences with deep meditation. Most people are not capable of that, but certainly we help people prepare and invite them to meditate, just try and get into that space a little bit. But I think our kind of default assumption is that it's really the medicine that's quieting the ego, and then we take advantage of that quiet period more so than we're trying to create the circumstances to create that quiet period.
I see. And so when you say that you're trying to take advantage of that quiet period, is that where the psychotherapy, is that something that you're trying to accomplish through the psychotherapy?
That's exactly right. So the way I conceive of why psychedelic assisted therapies seem to be so effective is that there's kind of three things happening. One is most psychedelics are serotonergic, which means you're getting a massive dump of serotonin. So you feel better pretty quickly, within a half an hour typically of administration, and sometimes much shorter than that. People's mood just improves because you have a large release of serotonin. Secondly, during psychedelic experience, a little bit less so with ketamine, it depends on the person, but during a psychedelic experience across the platform, people often seem to revisit past traumas, past experiences, and can see them without the charge that those moments have had on them, whether it's a very traumatic incident, like someone who has PTSD, or, if it's a small T trauma, like all of us have to some degree about, my mom wasn't there when I needed her to be there when I was 12 years old, and I never really forgot. People can go back and see it from a new lens. And so in many ways, what we see happening is people getting the breakthroughs that they would try to achieve through talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy on an emotional level in a single session or two sessions, whereas it'd take 30 or 40 or 50 or years in traditional therapy to get there. So you got this serotonin release, which improves mood. You've got this emotional processing that seems to happen. And then you have this neuroplasticity, during which the default mode network is still quiet and your brain is actually going through synaptogenesis. And I think it's that last piece, and the last two pieces where the psychotherapy I think really kicks in, which is to the extent that you're able to revisit a past trauma and share that with your therapist can then reinforce the updated perspective that you have on that particular experience in your life. And then, as I mentioned before, in addition to that, help you achieve better lifestyle habits. So if it's if enhanced gratitude, practicing gratitude and writing in the 5-minute journal and all that kind of stuff is going to help you kind of work through maybe those issues that came up, or maybe just entirely independently. That's what we're trying to get to through the psychotherapy aspect of it.
Got it. Understood. Yeah. And so now I wanted to go back to set and setting. So as many members of the audience will be aware, set and setting are really important for ensuring that a trip goes well. And FieldTrip has clearly put a lot of effort into cultivating the right set and setting for users. So I'll just quote from Coveteur magazine, which is a description of what you can expect from field trips. They say, before a session begins, you might sit mesmerized by a coffee table that moves, creating ever-changing sand artwork, or you might spend time in the Somadome, a pod where a combination of binaural beats and LED color therapy make meditation easier. Once you go to a treatment room, you'll be seated in a zero-gravity chair and given the option of being covered in a weighted blanket, wearing an eye mask, and listening to a custom-designed soundtrack. I'm not sure how up-to-date that article is and whether or not there have been any updates since then. But yeah, just walk us through your thought process there, how you decided to design each of the elements of these clinics, and whether or not you think there is a way to sort of improve set and setting without the need for lots of high-grade tech.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really see behind me because I have this fancy little background. But if you could see the bedroom that I'm broadcasting from right now, you would know that when it comes to aesthetics and design and decor, I am definitely out of my element. So, really, like all I can say is we worked with psychedelic therapists as well as people who are very experienced with psychedelics who also have design and decor backgrounds to develop our clinics. And one of the big opportunities, I think, in the psychedelic space is we have very beautiful clinics and people feel very comfortable and we get very positive feedback on them. But no one has really studied what it means to have a good set and setting. We're literally making it up based on what we think people feel comfortable in. And I think it's a really potentially interesting area of research as to whether a green light in a room or a fluorescent light in a room or one of those new incandescent kind of bulbs has an impact on it. Because I think we can get a lot more polished and scientific on those aspects. Obviously, there's going to be some degree of subjectivity, but it is. I think we can get a better handle on what good set and setting mean. From the decor aspects of our clinics, the only thing I can really touch on is every one of our clinics has a moss wall and lots of plants. So we really try and create a natural feeling in the spaces as opposed to entirely artificial. And there's something else I think you touched on, Kenneth, but I forget now. Is there anything else you want me to touch on?
Oh yeah, just whether or not you think that set and setting can be improved without the need for a lot of the high grade tech that you have in your clinics, because and this relates to the accessibility conversation too. Ways to improve set and setting at minimal cost.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not that high tech in our clinics. Yes, our zero gravity chairs are like $5,000 each, which are going to be out of the reach for maybe someone just buying a chair for their house. But there's no reason that a couch doesn't work just as well. And besides that, we have Bose noise canceling headphones and we have iPads. It's stuff that's not inexpensive, but it's certainly not out of reach for most people. And you don't, and then we're just trying to create an ideal experience because we're also trying to establish credibility in this space. And so we don't want someone to come in and have a bad experience because one of our headphones didn't work, right? It's not inexpensive, our therapy, as we try and make it comparable to cognitive behavioral therapy. But it's like those small things that if you just do a poor job on it, it can have a real negative impact on someone's experience. And it would just be a shame to do that. But truthfully, anywhere you feel comfortable is fine. It really doesn't have to be as posh as we've set it up to be. But we wanted to distinguish ourselves and what we're doing from the average ketamine clinic, where you're probably put into a windowless cubicle and given an IV drip, and want to really emphasize the importance of setting. And so we probably have over-indexed on it, but we're also trying to create a brand identity and a unique experience to FieldTrip. Doesn't mean it's the only way it can be done. It's just the way we've chosen to create it for our patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk about the drug development pipeline. So as you mentioned earlier, FieldTrip is developing its own psychedelic, which is meant to be similar to psilocybin, but with a shorter trip. So I'm wondering why you guys didn't go for something like DMT, which takes about 15 minutes, and therefore is a very short trip and potentially does have some very high therapeutic value.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it was a heavily debated subject at FieldTrip when we were picking our initial indication and our initial molecule. There seems to be a consensus, not a broad consensus, but a consensus that too short of a trip leaves something to be desired in terms of the therapeutic outcomes, and too long of a trip just becomes clinically inefficient. And so we considered DMT as a lead candidate, but we moved away from it from a couple of reasons. One is, DMT is kind of like going from 0 to ludicrous speed in a single dose, which is something that most people are probably not inclined to start with. It probably, if we're talking about genuinely sick people who are not psychedelically inclined, it probably is too much of a leap to start with, was what we kind of assessed from a clinical and medical perspective. B, the evidence around the therapeutic benefits of DMT just isn't as persuasive as it is for longer acting tryptamines. And C, as everyone on this call probably knows, developing a drug from inception through to approval is hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you can't generate meaningful IP on that, trying to make a return on that investment is a lot harder. It's one of the big things that I still don't fully understand for Compass Pathways and MAPS. They're hoping, MAPS can do it because most of their investment comes from donation, not investment. So the funders are not expecting a return on their investment. They just want to see it happen. With Compass Pathways, somehow Compass is going to have to market and sell enough Compass 360 in 5 years with data exclusivity to make a return, whereas most drugs don't make a return in 13 years with patent protection. So there's a significant business question as to how you make an ROI and return the capital that you invested to get to approval on something that doesn't have clear IP. And so we wanted to land on something that had a longer experience than DMT. Was certainly gentler than DMT, but another way, but was shorter than psilocybin. And we tried to thread the needle based on those characteristics. And 4-HO-DIPT, which is the psychedelic from which we derived FT104, fit that criteria in almost all respects. If you read Shulgin's notes on it, he describes it as very, almost indistinguishable from psilocybin. Subjectively, the duration of the experience is pretty precisely around 2 hours. Is overall gentle, and no one was focusing on it. And we realized that there was a way to enhance it through a prodrug strategy that makes it a better medicine, with more consistent bioavailability and solubility through our prodrug strategy. So all of those pieces of right length and market opportunity and IP kind of lined up, and so that's how we focused on FT104.
Yeah. So there are a number of psychedelic companies these days that are trying to develop psychedelics, but without the hallucinogenic or psychedelic qualities. Obviously, FieldTrip is really embracing the psychedelic aspects of ketamine, and the drug that you are developing is indeed a hallucinogenic psychedelic, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. Yeah.
Do you think that it is possible to achieve the therapeutic effects of psychedelics without the hallucinogenic qualities? Was FieldTrip at any point ever considering developing a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic for its drug discovery pipeline?
I have absolutely no idea if psychedelics are going to work. I think there's probably good reason to believe that they can be effective. Are they going to be as effective? My guess is probably not, simply because as I conceive of what's happening with the psychedelic experience, it seems to be those three levels of the serotonin, the emotional processing, which I think involves the trip, and then the neuroplasticity. That being said, I think that's an important opportunity, which is, I think doing the work, so to speak, with a psychedelic experience is going to lead to transformative outcomes, and is something that I certainly advocate for and would be my preferred path. But I think there's a lot of people who don't want to do the work, would rather be more engaged with a more conventional allopathic approach to medicine, which is here's your pill, take your pill and you'll feel better. There's nothing wrong with that. I hold no judgment towards that. And so certainly if psychedelics we can remove the hallucinogenic experience from it and create a real medicine that's going to help a lot of people, I think that's wonderful. I have absolutely no compunction with it. Do I think people should do the work and go through the trip? Absolutely. But, it's not for everyone. So I'd rather see people feeling, more integrated, happier, healthier than, even if it means they're only getting there 60% of the way, as opposed to say 100% of the way you could have with a psychedelic experience. That's totally fine by me.
Excellent.
And I'll just add that, something that we're also actively exploring, because I think there's a real opportunity there to help a lot of people as well. So we've got our FT200 series, which is our next pipeline project, where we're looking at not specifically non-psychedelic psychedelics, but psychedelics that don't engage the 2B liability, because with many of the classics, you have a 5-HT2B agonism happening, which with enough can create cardiac valvulopathy. I'm impressed I pronounced that word correctly. I guess I've listened to it being said enough times. And so I think there's a real opportunity, particularly from a microdosing lens, which people seem to want to talk about a lot these days. If you can create a psychedelic that is potentially non-hallucinogenic, but certainly has less 2B liability risk, then I think there's a real opportunity there. And that's kind of what we have with the FT200 series that we're working on as well.
Okay, that's all very interesting. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that, but I wanted to segue into the next segment of the Q&A, which is about integration.
Sure.
So after the therapy session offered by FieldTrip, patients return for a follow-up appointment called an integration session. And you mentioned that the FieldTrip in particular offers a cognitive behavioral therapy. First, could you just briefly walk the audience through what cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is? And secondly, can you explain why you guys use CBT rather than other types of therapies? And more generally, how do you decide the right psychotherapy for psychedelics?
Yeah, you're definitely pushing my limits and showing my blind sides, because I can't speak very intelligently to the side of the equation. What I can say is, when we first started, we really tried to, it's not the right word, but it's probably the most apt, productize the experience so we could offer a consistent clinical experience to everybody walking in the door. And we realized very quickly that with psychotherapy, it's almost impossible to do that you need to trust the discretion and intuition and skills of the therapist working with a particular individual to craft the experience and the integration work in a way that is meaningful and relevant to that particular person. And so the psychologists and therapists that we worked with to help craft that initial protocol really emphasized using motivational interviewing and behavioral activation as the techniques that should be used if you're going to productize it. So that's how we developed our protocol. And I think the vast majority of our therapists continue to use those techniques, but amongst an array of other ones as well, depending on the unique circumstances of that particular patient and their skill set. So, that's about the extent I can offer. I can't go into the depth of what is cognitive behavioral therapy versus other forms of therapy. I'm just not up to speed on the differences. I've tended to rely on the people who are experts in that to tell me how we should be doing it, as opposed to having a strong opinion myself.
So I understand the commercial motivations for using CBT. As you mentioned, it's something that's easy to productize. But what about the therapeutic motivations.
What do you mean by that?
By which I mean, so, CBT may be the kind of thing that you could deploy easily as a product, something that, people will be able to consistently use in therapy sessions. But to what extent is it especially well suited, I guess is the question for ketamine assisted psychotherapy?
I'm going to go with this extremely well suited and back that up with absolutely nothing, because I'm not the right person to answer that question. I couldn't provide anything in terms of thoughtful commentary.
Okay, sounds good. All right, great. So yeah, let's talk now about accessibility. So as you were mentioning at the beginning, in the UK, ketamine therapy is something that is legal and accessible, but only through private clinics. It's not available on the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK. To be prescribed on the NHS, it'd have to be approved by something called NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, as a cost-effective treatment. So what do you think the path forward would be for making ketamine therapy available on the NHS in the UK? And in general, what have you seen countries doing to make ketamine therapy available through public healthcare as opposed to just private healthcare?
Yeah, not a lot, which is the unfortunate answer. Because it's an off-label use, getting a lot of investment in the kind of research that's needed to get it approved for insurance reimbursement is a kind of a long, slow process. It's underway, certainly in the US, which has made a giant mess of its healthcare system by and large relative to the rest of the world. There are nonprofit organizations like Anthea that are working to develop the policies and approval guidelines that could be then implemented by insurers and payers to enable coverage to ketamine-assisted therapy. But the challenge is there's just not a whole lot of data that they can work with right now. So they got to spend the money to build the data to do so. And it's something that we're supporting, but I think the real driver, as you mentioned, in terms of what the factors of NICE are, is it cost-effective therapy? And I think unquestionably it is cost-effective when you see the results. When you see the results that we're generating, which people on average show significant improvements for 120 days or more post-treatment. And when you consider the fact that people experiencing depression and anxiety tend to consume 3% more medical resources, so a much bigger drain on public resources within the medical sphere. And the fact that for every 1 point improvement in a PHQ-9 score, there seems to be a correlated 1.6% improvement in productivity. It seems like a no-brainer that this is very cost-effective treatment. You just need to build the data to demonstrate that to an actuary at an insurer to say like, oh yes, the cost savings of getting people back to work and making them more productive is there. Again, it's all coming, but this is all relatively new, and it's only starting to hit a scale where it becomes meaningful for someone to do that research. In the meantime, it is probably cost prohibitive for too many people who need access to it. And because ketamine still has a negative legacy component associated with it being, when you speak to people for this first time about ketamine, inevitably the reaction I get was either the party drug or the horse tranquilizer. It's not something that a lot of organizations are keen to get in front of. With MDMA assisted therapy, by contrast, the FDA granted it breakthrough therapy designation. So it's kind of got a more positive light to come from than ketamine. So my expectation is that we will see insurance coverage for ketamine-assisted therapy at some point, but it's probably a couple of years away, at which point MDMA-assisted therapy will probably be approved and available in many jurisdictions. So it'll be interesting to see whether there continues to be the push for ketamine-assisted therapy for insurance reimbursement, or people just shift their focus to MDMA and psilocybin. That's, to me, to be determined, but that's kind of how I see the landscape right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you did mention, it is indeed prohibitively expensive for a lot of people. I was doing a bit of research into ketamine clinics in London earlier today, and it seems like the standard cost is around £3,600 for 6 sessions. I know the initial treatment that FieldTrip offers is $795 USD. And then you typically recommend, if I understand correctly, like 4 to 6 treatments. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So it comes out to quite a high cost. Where does that cost come from? I know that a lot of that is psychotherapy, which can be accounted for, which can be reimbursed through a lot of healthcare providers. But then there's also just the ketamine itself. So is just, the process of obtaining the drug what's driving the cost in this case?
Uh, Partly. I mean, the ketamine itself is kind of inexpensive, but you just have to keep in mind that what we're looking at is, um, you need a doctor present, you need a psychiatrist who does a screening, you need a nurse practitioner, on staff. We have respiratory therapists, we have 1 or 2 therapists sitting with a person. A person's in our space probably. The ketamine experience is a couple of hours, but total they're probably in for 4 or 5 hours from start to finish. And you start to appreciate that there's just a lot of time of some very experienced professionals at play here. And even at $750, it's, there's not a whole lot of margin in it by the time you pay everybody. And it's not like, it would be nice if therapists could just go, treat it like, and I'm being very glib here, so please don't take it seriously, but treat it like a factory line or like a burger shop where they could just flip out burgers and just like churn people through ketamine assisted therapy. But it is a very intense, emotionally draining process for all of our therapists. So after, if one of our therapists can do 2 patients a day, that's probably a lot, even though in pure time, that's only 4 hours in terms of emotional investment and energy. It's a full day. But those therapists also need to get paid, and they need to have time. You can start to see that that's not a viable option for them. So the cost is really just in the time allocated to the professionals involved in the entire experience. That's where the vast, and it's going to be true across all psychedelics. If you look at the MAPS protocol, for example, now this is certainly over engineered to make sure that MAPS is successful in their clinical trials, but each session requires 84 hours of therapist time. Each individual session requires 84 hours. That there's no way that can't be expensive. Dick Simon, who's part of the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative, kind of likens it, and I appreciate it. He's like, it's like, listen, heart surgery is very effective or very expensive, but it's also very effective. And so if we start thinking about MDMA assisted therapy in that same kind of lens of just how effective it is, like comparable to heart surgery, it doesn't look that expensive, but because we still don't value mental health in the way we value physical health, there's still a hurdle to overcome. But do fully expect, and because MAPS has been able to do the health economics around their therapies, would suggest that MDMA assisted therapy should on average save $100,000 USD per patient over the lifetime of that patient. It becomes much more persuasive for insurance. And so I think you will see much more robust insurance for MDMA assisted therapy as it becomes available than we have with ketamine right now.
Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, you mentioned you're highlighting the necessity for many healthcare professionals to be involved in ketamine therapy and psychedelic therapy in general, and that's driving the cost. And certainly, that that's also really relevant in the UK, in that, the NHS is already massively overburdened, huge wait times. And so it doesn't have the resources to administer psychedelic therapy for many hours. Do you think that it's possible to get to a point with ketamine therapy where it could be administered by people who aren't medical professionals, like, for example, a nurse, and would that be safe?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. So in most of our clinics, it's actually a nurse practitioner who is doing the prescribing and administration of ketamine. Ketamine is very safe overall, especially at the sub-anesthetic doses that we're talking about. So yeah, I think a nurse that has experience in overseeing psychedelic experiences would be more than qualified to do this kind of work. But again, if you're doing this as a psychedelic assisted therapy, that nurse would still need to be present, for most of that duration. So, just doing simple math, if an average therapist is $150 an hour, if they're there for 2 hours, that's already $300, just pure cost from a field trip perspective. And then it doesn't include the medicine or the nurse or anything else along those lines. So it is fundamentally a challenge. And just going back to your point about the kind of analysis you did on London, I'm pretty sure just living in London is cost prohibitive for just about everybody on the planet, actually. But 3,600 pounds is a lot without question. But I guess if you compare it on a dollar for dollar basis, it probably works out to not too dissimilar to the rates you see in the US.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting that you say that you do think that a nurse would be qualified to administer ketamine therapy, because this actually does relate to a question that I was going to ask in the integration section, which is that, one very important quality of psychedelic experiences is they can completely shatter your ego, not merely quiet your ego, but shatter your ego, and give you really profound transformative realizations that shake you at the core of your psyche. I could see that in the chat, some people were asking about K-holing. If I understand correctly, ketamine FieldTrip doesn't offer ketamine therapy at the doses where K-holing would be possible, but nonetheless, it is important to consider, right, the possibility that somebody could have a really, groundbreaking, earth-shaking kind of revelation through the ketamine therapy. And when you're experiencing something like that, right, you want to make sure that the person who's there to pick up the pieces really knows how to put them back together. So, do you see any dangers with regards to that in a system where nurses are administering ketamine therapy? Would it be important to have a licensed professional on hand there?
Here's like the fundamental paradox, which is every kind of licensing or degree regime we have only tests a person's capacity for IQ and not EQ. And what we need in these moments is not IQ, we need EQ, right? So I think a nurse can be equally as emotionally aware and sensitive and conscious for what a person is going through and help people rebuild their psyche as much as a person who has a psychotherapy degree on the wall, because all you've really validated by putting that degree on your wall is that you can write a test. And this is the whole problem with most of our academic structures right now. So I'm a big believer that you don't, a lot of people say, well, you have to have psychedelic experience to be able to be a psychedelic therapist. I don't think that's true. I think in most cases that's probably true, but I don't think that's true about everyone, because I think some people just have that innate natural capacity to be great therapists, small T therapists, without a degree, and be really equipped to help people through these experiences regardless. So is there risk? I suppose so. I don't know really how you qualify against that risk, because other than mandating some sort of apprenticeship program, which is not necessarily a bad idea, and by and large, all new therapists who come on board with us, if they don't have experience or training before, typically shadow the existing therapist. But other than mandating an apprenticeship program, and now we have to go back to considering the costs, all that. I don't know how you can control for that, other than hopefully, people self-select for doing this properly or not. It's one of the big challenges we have in terms of how we evolve this space in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just speaking from personal experience, I know of a number of people who are indeed naturally well suited to, if not administering therapy, at least looking after a friend when they're having a bad experience with psychedelics. But and so it is more of a subjective thing that does involve EQ rather than IQ, as you're saying. But again, it seems important to have some kind of system in practice that is methodical and well thought through to ensure that people are indeed able to administer therapy effectively after a bad psychedelic experience. Yep. I wanted to actually start transitioning to the questions from the audience. Sure. We have quite a few. And again, audience members, feel free to post your questions in the chat and I'll read them out loud. First one is from Lou. She says, very interesting discussion. What happens after the 120 days of effectiveness? I assume she means effectiveness of ketamine therapy. Do you need to repeat the sessions, or is there another kind of approach to get better?
Yeah, so what we see is that around the 120-day mark, the improvements start to tick up, and we haven't measured from 120 days to 180 or 240 or 360. So it's not entirely clear, at least on an objective basis, what happens at that point. But it seems to suggest that people start to revert back to their baseline. what we see typically is many patients, probably about 30 to 40%, will come back after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months for a single ketamine exploration session. So they're not doing that whole protocol. They're just doing one session, maybe with one integration session. And that seems, this is purely anecdotal, to help people maintain the benefits and feel, significant improvements. So I don't have any objective data around that, but that's what we seem to be seeing on average.
Excellent. Melinda asks, and this relates to K-holing as we were just discussing, have there been studies / experiments of the therapeutic efficacy of K-hole doses of ketamine versus lower doses?
From what I understand, actually, the interest in ketamine was kind of a byproduct of people noticing that when used as an anesthetic, so essentially putting people into a K-hole, the people who received it as an anesthetic reported positive mental health benefits. And that's what triggered the research into the mental health applications. So it does seem that K-holing probably can have positive mental health benefits, and it probably does also induce the synaptogenesis that we see, but I'm not familiar with any specific studies about trying to drop someone into a K-hole and see if it leads to mental health improvements.
Right. Yeah. And so related to that, Sana asks, can you please shed some light on the K-holing process specifically? Is K-holing the climax, or I guess like the peak of the ketamine experience? Because for me, it's the highest point of dissociation that I've experienced.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I mean, I've never experienced a K-hole, but as near as I can tell, it's kind of like the equivalent of blacking out. And so to the extent that some of the benefit of the psychedelic therapy comes from the insights and awareness that come from the journey, to the extent that you can't remember them, it feels like you're losing a piece of the equation. But again, I'm not well equipped to respond to that besides what I can speculate about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the important attributes of a K-hole is that it sort of fulfills the psychedelic aspects of a ketamine experience, in the sense that like you could experience full-blown ego dissolution during a K-hole. And so related to that, Melinda asks, have you seen any spiritual manifestations that accompany the ketamine experience similar to the psychedelic experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anecdotally in our patient population, a lot of people, if they don't have a full spiritual kind of breakthrough, they've definitely opened them up to sensations of awe and wonder that didn't exist before, and a recognition that maybe life on Earth or this experience is more complex than what science can measure right now. If you get a chance, we have a podcast called FieldTripping, and one of the last episodes we did before the new year was with a gentleman named Julian Uzielli, who's actually a producer for the CBC in Canada. And he came in kind of like as a secret shopper. He didn't tell us that he was coming in, but he produced a documentary about it. And I spoke with him after. And in so many ways, he was reminiscent of a good friend of mine who was like very smart, very articulate, and very opposed to the notion of anything that's remotely metaphysical or spiritual. And after his ketamine experience, and then one of the, I thought, powerful moments of the podcast was when he's talking about the fact that it opened up to the possibility maybe is not is all as it seems. And I think it's a really powerful moment for people when they can accept that there's more than they can perceive in the conventional five senses sense. I think it's a really powerful moment. So we see that quite a bit within our patient population, but I don't have anything concrete that I can point to in terms of numbers.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate on what it means for people to experience something that they can't make sense of in terms of, a Western scientific framework, as you're saying. So I mean, can you sort of articulate, especially for people who haven't had these experiences before, what it's like to have a sublime, ineffable experience while you're on ketamine?
I mean, obviously it's ineffable, so it's hard.
Right.
But here, I'll give you my most germane example, which is If anybody's doing Wordle these days, which seems to be a big thing, and you look at those same letters, if you don't know what Wordle is, but it's like basically a game where you get 5 letters and you have to reorient them to figure out the word, right? And you can stare at the same 5 words and be like, there's no way to solve this problem. There's no way to solve this problem. And then you have that moment where like you see things differently, and all of a sudden all these opportunities that were not in your purview become open to you, right? And I would speculate, and there's no scientific basis for it, but I know at least based on my subjective experience, the times I'm at my worst or feel my worst is when I feel trapped, when I feel there's no way out from the circumstances that I'm in. And that feels like limbo, right? There's no path forward. There's no path backwards. There's no path up. There's no path down. I'm stuck here. And when you open people up to new possibilities, just a little bit, all of a sudden those blinders can come open a little bit or a lot. And that's one of the most freeing things. And so if I was going to talk about what the brand essence or what the promise of FieldTrip is, I often describe it as freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from, your depression and your anxiety. Freedom to be whatever you want, do whatever you want, kind of thing. But the core concept is freedom, feeling not stuck, not trapped anymore, I think is the single most effective thing. And when you open yourself up to the sublime, the transcendent, the metaphysical, all those things that many people in this very hyper rational Western world deny the existence of, you create at least space for possibility. And I think that's really one of the big things that go hand in hand here.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to get to a question from Lou. Does FieldTrip welcome people who don't have the huge traumas you mentioned, but might want to work on something else? And she also asked if FieldTrip treats people with addiction.
It's jurisdiction. Sorry, this is going to have to be my last question because I have to hop to another meeting. I apologize for that. And I'll say thank you for having me on. Kenna, thank you for inviting me, and
Absolutely.
for everyone for listening. It's jurisdiction by jurisdiction specific. So in Ontario, where I am, we can only treat people with treatment-resistant mental health conditions. In California, for example, the doctor has a lot more flexibility, so it doesn't have to be treatment-resistant. It could be dysthymia or adjustment disorder. As long as the doctor feels like there's a medical need, that's usually sufficient. And with respect to addiction, we're opening up the conversation internally on our therapeutic teams as to whether we'll treat different forms of addiction with it. Usually what we've done is we've definitely treated people with addiction, but we've the medical justification is we're treating the depression associated with the addiction, not the addiction itself. But that could evolve, especially as more and more data comes out. And I think just last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a study from Awaken, which is in the UK, suggesting that their ketamine plus therapy protocol is very effective at treating alcohol use disorder. So that certainly gives more scope to the possibility of treating addictions with ketamine.
Excellent. Sorry you have to go, Ronan, and sorry to all the audience members whose questions we weren't able to get to. But thank you so much, nonetheless, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you to all the audience members for coming. I'll see you.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for the opportunity, Kenneth.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.